I carried the heavy ceramic dish through the bride's family kitchen like I was carrying my own heart on a platter. The aroma of my signature lamb roast filled the air, cumin, cardamom, and that secret blend of spices I'd perfected over 20 years. Steam rose from the golden brown meat, and I felt that familiar surge of pride watching everyone's heads turn toward the scent. The pre-wedding lunch was in full swing, and I had arrived precisely when I'd promised. The bride's mother, Mina, barely glanced up from her conversation with the wedding planner. Her daughters clustered around the marble island, their manicured nails tapping against wine glasses as they discussed seating arrangements. I placed the dish on the counter with the careful reverence it deserved. This wasn't just food, this was my contribution to what I believed was a celebration of family. The lamb had been marinating since dawn, the spices ground by hand, every element crafted with the devotion I'd shown to every family gathering for the past 2 decades. "Lunch is served," I announced, my voice carrying the warmth I felt whenever I shared my cooking. The bride, Zara, looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from distraction to something I couldn't quite read. Mina approached the dish, and I waited for the recognition I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, she lifted the lid and wrinkled her nose as if she'd detected something unpleasant. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard directed at me before. The question hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, certain I'd misunderstood. "It's the lamb roast," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "The one I always make for special occasions." Zara's cousin, Farah, snorted. "Auntie, this looks like something from those village restaurants on the highway. You know, the ones with the checkered tablecloths and the greasy walls." The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate. I felt my face flush, but I tried to maintain my composure. "I used the same recipe I've always used," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper now. "Maybe that's the problem," Zara said, not looking at me as she spoke. "We're having a sophisticated wedding, Auntie. Not a village feast." The words struck me like slaps. I watched as Mina pushed the dish aside, making space for the catered sandwiches that had been arranged on expensive platters. The contrast was deliberate and cruel. My handcrafted meal dismissed for store-bought elegance. Farah had her phone out before I could process what was happening. "This is too good not to share," she said, angling the camera to capture both my dish and my face. "Look what Auntie brought to the pre-wedding lunch. Village trash at its finest." The recording light blinked red, and I stood frozen as she narrated my humiliation for her audience. Within seconds, she was typing furiously, and I knew the video was being shared in the family group chat, the same chat where I'd been relegated to silence for months while wedding plans were discussed around me. The laughter grew louder, more pointed. Someone made a comment about knowing your place, and another voice suggested I stick to simple dishes next time. Each word landed like a stone, building a wall between me and the family I'd spent decades trying to serve. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching the women who had once praised my cooking now treating it, and me, like an embarrassment. The bride's mother didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She was already back to her wedding planner, discussing flower arrangements as if I'd never existed. Without a word, I began to gather my things. My hands shook as I reached for my purse, and I could feel their eyes on me, not with concern, but with the satisfied cruelty of people who had successfully put someone in their place. I left the dish where it was. Let them deal with it. Let them explain to their guests why the kitchen smelled like heaven but their table was filled with mediocrity. As I walked toward the door, I heard Farah reading the comments on her video aloud, each laughing emoji a fresh wound. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood in the driveway for a moment, breathing in the afternoon air. I wasn't broken, not yet. But something had shifted inside me, something that had been dormant for too long. The humiliation burned, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something that felt like the beginning of a fire I'd been trying to extinguish for 20 years. That laughter followed me home, echoing in my mind as I sat in my modest flat 6 months later, remembering when things had been different. When I'd first received the call about Zara's engagement, I'd been washing dishes in the same kitchen. And I'd nearly dropped a plate in my excitement. The memory came flooding back as I stared at the wedding invitation propped against my window. 6 months ago, I'd been part of the celebration. 6 months ago, I'd been the one they turned to for help. I remembered that spring evening when Zara had called me, her voice bright with joy. "Auntie Syra, I'm engaged. Can you believe it? I'm actually getting married." I'd cried with happiness for her, and when she'd asked if I could help with the wedding, I'd said yes without hesitation. That's when I'd offered to cover the venue deposit, $5,000 that represented 3 months of my savings, but I'd given it gladly. The next day, I'd driven to the wedding venue with Zara and her mother, my checkbook in hand. I'd written the check while they toured the gardens, and when the wedding planner had thanked me, Zara had hugged me tight and whispered, "You're like a second mother to me, Auntie. I don't know what I'd do without you." That afternoon, I'd suggested cooking the main dishes for the reception. It seemed natural. I'd been feeding this family for decades, and my recipes were always the first to disappear at gatherings. Zara had been thrilled, clapping her hands together and declaring it perfect, but even then, there had been signs I'd chosen to ignore. During the planning meetings that followed, I'd found myself sitting on the periphery while others made decisions. When the florist arrived to discuss arrangements, I'd offered suggestions based on my experience with dinner parties, but Mina had dismissed them with a wave of her hand. "Let's leave the decorating to the professionals," she'd said, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never considered that my opinions might matter. I'd watched as younger cousins were consulted about everything from music to seating arrangements, while my contributions were relegated to the kitchen. When I'd suggested a timeline for food preparation, the wedding planner had looked to Mina for confirmation rather than acknowledging my expertise directly. The pattern had been subtle but consistent. My financial contribution was accepted without fanfare, my cooking skills were taken for granted, and my presence at planning meetings was tolerated rather than welcomed. I'd told myself it was just the stress of wedding planning, that everyone was busy and overwhelmed, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Even 6 months ago, I'd been feeling the gentle push toward the margins. When group photos were taken at the engagement party, I'd been the one holding everyone's purses. When toasts were made, I'd been the one serving drinks. When decisions were announced, I'd been the one learning about them secondhand. I'd brushed off these small hurts, telling myself that service was love, that being useful was enough. I'd convinced myself that my quiet contribution mattered more than public recognition, that my value to the family was understood even if it wasn't always acknowledged. Looking back now, I could see how naive I'd been. The deposit I'd paid had been mentioned to others as family money. The recipes I'd shared had been discussed as traditional family dishes. Even my presence at planning meetings had been explained as extra help rather than integral involvement, but 6 months ago, I'd still believed in the family I'd been serving. I'd still thought my place was secure, that my decades of devotion had earned me something more than tolerance. I'd still believed that love was enough, that service was valued, that being good to people meant they would be good to you. The evening light was fading outside my window, and I could see my reflection in the glass, a woman who'd spent 20 years perfecting recipes for people who'd never bothered to learn her birthday. I'd been so eager to belong, so desperate to be needed, that I'd ignored every sign that I was being used. Tomorrow was the wedding, and I still had a decision to make. I could show up as planned, serve my food with a smile, and pretend that video had never happened. I could continue being the family member who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. Or I could finally admit that the fire burning in my chest had been lit by years of accumulated kindness that had never been returned. The humiliation from this afternoon wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of decades of being taken for granted, dismissed, and ultimately discarded when I was no longer useful. The notification sound from my phone cut through the evening silence like a blade. I'd been sitting in my kitchen since dusk, staring at my hands and trying to process what had happened at the lunch. But the digital chirp forced me back to the present, back to the reality of my humiliation going viral. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers, though I already knew what I would find. The family group chat was alive with activity, dozens of messages, reaction emojis, and comments about the video Farah had posted. The notification count kept climbing, 15 new messages, 18, 22. I opened the chat and immediately saw the video thumbnail, my face, frozen in a moment of shocked hurt, standing behind my rejected dish. The caption read, "When village aunties try to crash sophisticated weddings, face with tears of joy, face with tears of joy, face with tears of joy." The comments were worse than I'd expected. Laughing emojis filled the screen, each one a tiny digital dagger. My own relatives, people whose children I'd babysat, whose birthdays I'd remembered, whose problems I'd listened to, were finding entertainment in my pain. "Poor Auntie Syra," someone had written, followed by a crying laughing emoji. "She means well, but this is why we need to be more direct with people," another comment read. "Some folks don't understand boundaries." I scrolled through months of messages I'd never seen before, realizing I'd been excluded from so many conversations. Plans had been made, decisions finalized, and celebrations arranged while I'd been kept in the dark. My messages from weeks ago, offers to help with decorations, suggestions for menu items, questions about timing, had been ignored completely. The pattern was undeniable now. I found messages where my cooking had been discussed as too ethnic for the wedding aesthetic. There were conversations about managing expectations and keeping certain people happy without letting them take over. I wasn't named directly, But the context made it clear they were talking about me. One message from 3 weeks ago made my blood run cold. We need to figure out how to use her money without dealing with her drama. The response from another family member, just let her cook something for the pre-wedding lunch. That'll make her feel included. I'd been managed. Manipulated. My genuine desire to contribute had been calculated and controlled from the beginning. The lunch invitation hadn't been an honor, it had been a bone thrown to keep me quiet. I kept scrolling, discovering layers of deception I'd never suspected. My deposit had been mentioned as family funding in discussions with vendors. My recipe suggestions had been forwarded to the caterer without my knowledge or credit. Even my offer to help with setup had been discussed as free labor rather than family participation. The most painful discovery was a message from just last week. Has anyone told Auntie Syra that we're using a professional caterer now? Someone needs to manage her expectations so she doesn't show up expecting to cook. The response, let's just see what happens. She'll figure it out. They'd known. They'd all known that my cooking wouldn't be needed, that my contribution would be rejected, that I would be humiliated. And they'd let it happen anyway because it was easier than having an honest conversation with me. I set the phone down and walked to my kitchen drawer, the one where I kept important documents. My hands were steady now, my mind clear with a cold fury I'd never experienced before. I pulled out the folder containing all my wedding-related papers, receipts, contracts, correspondence. The venue contract was on top, my signature clear and legal at the bottom. As the person who'd paid the deposit, I was listed as a co-signatory on the catering arrangements. I'd forgotten about that detail, but now it seemed like providence. I spread the papers across my kitchen table, studying each document with the attention of someone planning a military campaign. The catering contract could be modified or cancelled with 24-hour notice. The venue had my contact information as primary. The florist had my number as backup coordination. For 20 years, I'd been the invisible woman who made everything work behind the scenes. I'd been the one who remembered details, who followed up on arrangements, who ensured nothing fell through the cracks. They'd relied on my competence while dismissing my presence, but they'd made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to use my money and my skills while excluding me from recognition, they'd left me with all the power they'd never imagined I would use. My phone buzzed again with more messages, more laughter at my expense. But I didn't feel humiliated anymore. I felt something far more dangerous. I felt awakened. Tomorrow was their perfect wedding, their sophisticated celebration that was too elegant for my village cooking. They wanted professionalism? They wanted to show me my place? They wanted to make me disappear. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling until I found the number for the catering company. My finger hovered over the call button for just a moment before I pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Before someone answered. Hello, I said, my voice steady and clear. I need to make some changes to tomorrow's catering order. The phone call to the caterer triggered something deep in my memory, transporting me back 15 years to a moment when my cooking had been celebrated rather than scorned. I was standing in a different kitchen then, younger and full of dreams. I'd since learned to swallow. The regional cooking competition had been held in the community center downtown, and I'd entered on a whim after my coworker had dared me to. You're always talking about your recipes, she'd said. Put your money where your mouth is. I'd spent weeks perfecting my entry, a complex lamb dish that required 3 days of preparation and techniques I'd learned from my grandmother. The spice blend alone took hours to perfect, grinding cardamom and cinnamon by hand, toasting cumin seeds until they released their essential oils. The morning of the competition, I'd arrived at the center with my arms full of ingredients and my heart full of hope. I'd never competed before, had never put my cooking up for public judgment, but something inside me had been hungry for recognition. The other contestants were intimidating, culinary school graduates, restaurant owners, food bloggers with impressive followings. I'd almost turned around and gone home, but the registration fee was non-refundable, and I'd taken the day off work. As I'd prepared my dish, I'd felt the familiar peace that came with cooking. My hands had moved with practiced confidence, seasoning by instinct, adjusting flavors by taste rather than measurement. The kitchen had filled with the aroma of my creation, and I'd noticed other contestants glancing over with interest. When the judging began, I'd stood behind my dish with my heart pounding. The judges, a mix of local chefs and food critics, had approached each station with serious expressions and careful notes. When they'd reached my station, their faces had changed. The first judge had taken a bite and closed her eyes, chewing slowly. This is extraordinary, she'd said, her voice carrying genuine surprise. The depth of flavor, the technique, where did you learn to cook like this? I'd stammered something about family recipes and years of practice, but inside I'd been soaring. For the first time in my adult life, someone outside my family was recognizing my skill, my passion, my art. When they'd announced the winners, I'd heard my name called for first place and thought I'd misunderstood. But there it was, my name, my dish, my achievement. I'd walked to the front of the room in a daze, accepting a trophy and a cash prize while cameras flashed and people applauded. The local newspaper had wanted an interview, and I'd agreed, still giddy with triumph. The reporter had asked about my plans, whether I'd considered opening a restaurant or teaching cooking classes. I'd shared my dream of maybe starting a small catering business, of turning my passion into something more than just family meals, but then I'd made the mistake of going home to celebrate with my family. I'd walked into my sister's house, the same house where I'd been humiliated today, carrying my trophy and bursting with news. Mina had been in the kitchen, as always, but she'd barely looked up when I'd entered. "You're late," she'd said. "We already started dinner." I'd held up my trophy, my face bright with joy. "I won," I'd said. "I won the cooking competition. First place." The silence that followed had been deafening. Mina had finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. "A cooking competition," she'd repeated, as if the words tasted bitter. "The newspaper wants to interview me," I'd continued, desperate to share my happiness. "They asked about opening a restaurant. Can you believe it? Me, with my own restaurant." That's when Mina had laughed, the same cold laugh I'd heard today. "Syra, you need to get your head out of the clouds. Trophies don't cook husbands. Trophies don't raise children. You're 35 years old, and you're acting like a teenager with fantasies." The words had hit me like physical blows. I'd looked around the room, hoping for support from other family members, but they'd all been studying their plates or their phones, uncomfortable with the tension but unwilling to intervene. "What about the newspaper interview?" I'd asked, my voice smaller now. "What about it?" Mina had replied. "You want to make a fool of yourself in public? You want people to think you're getting above your station? You cook well, Syra. We all know that. But don't let it go to your head." I'd stood there holding my trophy, feeling my joy drain away like water through a sieve. The dreams I'd been nurturing for hours, the restaurant, the recognition, the independence, had crumbled under the weight of my sister's disapproval. I'd cancelled the newspaper interview the next day, telling the reporter I'd changed my mind. I'd put the trophy in a drawer and never entered another competition. I'd told myself that Mina was right, that I was being unrealistic, that contentment was more important than ambition, but now, 15 years later, I realized what I'd lost. That day, I'd lost more than a business opportunity or a moment of fame. I'd lost the belief that my talents were worth celebrating, that my dreams were worth pursuing, that my voice deserved to be heard. I'd spent the next decade and a half proving my worth through service, through sacrifice, through making myself indispensable to people who'd never valued my independence. I'd cooked for their parties, babysat their children, and funded their celebrations while my own dreams gathered dust. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same cooking they'd dismissed as village trash today had once been worthy of recognition, of prizes, of newspaper interviews. My skills hadn't diminished, but my willingness to let others define my worth had grown. As I sat in my kitchen now, surrounded by the evidence of my planned rebellion, I felt that 15-year-old fire rekindling in my chest. The competition trophy was still in my drawer, tarnished but intact. Maybe it was time to remember what I'd been capable of before I'd learned to make myself small. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window as I dialed the catering company's number for the second time. My hands were steady now, my voice clear and professional. The documents spread across my table told the story of my legal authority: contracts signed, deposits paid, arrangements made in my name. "Good morning, this is Syra Ahmad calling about the Zara Mansour wedding catering order for today," I said when someone answered. "I need to make some significant changes to the arrangement." The voice on the other end was cheerful and accommodating. "Of course, Ms. Ahmad. What adjustments would you like to make?" I took a deep breath, feeling the power of my position for the first time in years. "I'm canceling the entire order. All of it. The appetizers, the main course, the desserts, everything needs to be cancelled immediately." There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. "I see you're listed as the primary contact and co-signatory on the catering contract. You do have the authority to make these changes. But this is quite last minute, the wedding is this afternoon." "I understand the timing," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm exercising my contractual right to cancel within the 24-hour window specified in Clause 7 of our agreement." I'd studied those contracts like a lawyer preparing for trial. Every clause, every provision, every escape route had been memorized. The catering company had been thorough in their paperwork, but they'd also been honest about the terms. "The cancellation will result in a 50% fee," the representative warned. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" I'm absolutely certain, I replied. Please confirm the cancellation in writing and send it to my email address. I'll handle the financial consequences. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen for a moment, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. In a few hours, 200 wedding guests would arrive expecting a professional meal, and there would be nothing. The bride, her mother, and all the relatives who'd laughed at my village trash cooking would face the reality of their dependence on me, but I wasn't finished. I opened my laptop and began typing, creating a new catering order with a different company, one that specialized in traditional, authentic cuisine. The kind of food I'd been perfecting for decades, the kind of dishes that had won competitions and earned genuine praise. I ordered enough ingredients to feed the entire wedding party: lamb for my signature roast, rice for the biryani that had made my grandmother famous, vegetables for the curry that had been my mother's recipe. I arranged for emergency delivery to my address, not the wedding venue. The second catering company was expensive, rush orders always were, but I didn't care about the cost. I'd spent years pouring my money into other people's celebrations. Today, I was investing in my own dignity. As I finalized the arrangements, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in months. This wasn't about revenge, exactly. It was about reclaiming my space in a family that had tried to erase me. It was about showing them the difference between my authentic contribution and their manufactured sophistication. My phone buzzed with a text from the wedding planner. Syra, just confirming you'll be at the venue by 2 p.m. to help with setup. The flowers are gorgeous. I smiled as I typed my response, I'll be there. Don't worry about the food, I have everything under control. It wasn't a lie. I did have everything under control, perhaps for the first time in years. The wedding planner had no idea that the elaborate catering arrangements had just been cancelled, that the professional staff wouldn't be arriving, that the sophisticated menu had been reduced to nothing. I walked to my bedroom and selected my outfit carefully. Not the modest, background-appropriate dress I'd originally planned, but something that commanded attention. A deep red sari that brought out the strength in my eyes, jewelry that caught the light, a confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. As I got ready, I thought about the hours ahead. The guests would arrive expecting perfection, and they would find chaos. The bride would panic, her mother would rage, and the family would scramble to solve a problem they'd created by dismissing the one person who could have prevented it, but I would be there, calm and prepared, with a solution that would remind everyone of my true value. I would transform their crisis into my triumph, their humiliation into my redemption. The delivery truck arrived at noon, bringing crates of the finest ingredients I'd ordered. I directed the workers to stack everything in my kitchen, then spent the next hour packing it all into my car. The logistics were complicated, but I'd been organizing family events for decades. I knew how to manage chaos. Before leaving for the venue, I took one last look around my kitchen. The space that had been my sanctuary, my workshop, my place of creation was about to become my launch pad. I'd spent years cooking in isolation, serving others while remaining invisible. Today, I would cook in public, in front of everyone who dismissed me, using skills they'd never bothered to recognize. I would transform their wedding from a disaster into a celebration, not because I owed them anything, but because I owed myself the chance to be seen. I locked my apartment door and walked to my car, feeling the weight of my decision and the lightness of my freedom. The wedding was in 3 hours, and I was ready to remind everyone, including myself, exactly who Syra Ahmad really was. The wedding venue was in chaos when I arrived, and I'd never seen anything more beautiful. Guests were milling around the reception hall, checking their watches and glancing toward the empty serving tables. The wedding planner was on her phone, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. The flowers were indeed gorgeous, cascading white roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The linens were crisp and perfect, the lighting was soft and romantic, and the tables were set with crystal and gold that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Everything was perfect except for the one thing that mattered most: there was no food. I watched as Mina stormed across the room toward the wedding planner, her face red with fury. "Where is the catering staff?" she demanded. "The reception started 20 minutes ago, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, on those tables." The wedding planner looked up from her phone, her expression helpless. "I've been trying to reach them for the past hour. They're not answering their phones, and their office says the order was cancelled. There must be some mistake." "Cancelled?" Mina's voice rose to a pitch that made several guests turn around. Who would cancel the catering for a wedding? That's when I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I'd changed into my red sari, and I could feel the weight of every eye in the room as I approached the panicked group. "The catering was cancelled by the person who arranged it," I said, my voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity. "The person who paid for it. The person whose signature was on the contract." Mina turned to stare at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Syra, what are you talking about? I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, showing her the cancellation confirmation email. I'm talking about the fact that I arranged and paid for the catering, which gave me the legal right to cancel it. Which I did. This morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the string quartet seemed to sense the tension and let their music fade to nothing. 200 guests were now openly staring at our little group, and I could see phones being discreetly raised to record. The drama. You did what? Zara appeared beside her mother, her face pale with shock. Auntie, please tell me you're joking. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the confident bride from yesterday's humiliation, but a young woman who was finally beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. I'm not joking, I said. But I'm also not heartless. I wouldn't leave your guests hungry on your wedding day. I turned toward the doors, where the catering staff I'd hired were wheeling in the first of many carts. The aroma that followed them was unmistakable, the same spices, the same techniques, the same love I'd been putting into my cooking for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. There's been a change in today's menu. Instead of the originally planned catering, you'll be enjoying authentic traditional cuisine, prepared with recipes that have been in my family for generations. I walked to the center of the room, where a mobile kitchen station had been set up. The staff began arranging ingredients and equipment with military precision, and I could see the confusion on the guests' faces shifting to curiosity. Some of you may remember my cooking from family gatherings over the years, I continued, beginning to tie on an apron. Others may have heard about it in yesterday's social media posts, where it was described as village trash. A murmur ran through the crowd. I could see people checking their phones, finding the video, understanding the context. The whispers grew louder, and I caught fragments of conversation. That's the woman from the video. She's the one who paid for the wedding. This is incredible. I began to work, my hands moving with practiced confidence as I prepared the first dish. The portable burners were hot, the spices were fresh, and the ingredients were the finest quality money could buy. This wasn't the desperate effort of someone trying to prove herself. This was the skilled demonstration of someone who had nothing left to prove. The first dish was my signature lamb roast, the same recipe that had been rejected yesterday but prepared with the attention and presentation it deserved. I seasoned it with the precise measurements I'd perfected over decades, browning it to the exact shade I knew would seal in the flavors. As I worked, the room began to fill with an aroma that was impossible to ignore. Guests started moving closer, drawn by the scent and the spectacle. I could hear their conversations shifting from confusion to anticipation. Is that cardamom? Someone asked. It smells incredible, another voice responded. I glanced up to see the wedding photographer capturing every moment, his camera clicking rapidly as he documented what was clearly becoming the most memorable wedding reception he'd ever covered. Mina stood frozen near the head table, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't name. The wedding planner was frantically taking notes, probably wondering if she should stop me or help me. And Zara was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like respect. The first course was ready in 30 minutes, and I began plating it with the same care I'd shown in the competition 15 years ago. Each plate was a work of art, the meat tender and perfectly seasoned, the sauce rich and complex, the presentation elegant enough for any five-star restaurant. I nodded to the serving staff, and they began distributing the plates to the guests. The first person to taste it was an elderly uncle I'd fed at dozens of family gatherings over the years. He took a bite, closed his eyes, and smiled. Now this, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, is real food. The transformation in the room was immediate and undeniable. What had begun as confused murmurs evolved into genuine appreciation as guests tasted the first course. I watched faces change from skepticism to surprise to delight, and I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. This is extraordinary, I heard someone say. Where did this come from? I continued working, preparing the second course while the first was being consumed with enthusiasm. The biryani required precise timing, the rice had to be perfectly cooked, the meat tender, the saffron aromatic. I'd made this dish hundreds of times, but never under such scrutiny, never with such stakes. As I worked, guests began approaching me directly. An aunt I hadn't seen in years touched my arm gently. Syra, this is incredible. I had no idea you could cook like this. I looked up from the rice I was stirring, meeting her eyes. You've eaten my cooking at every family gathering for the past decade, I said, not unkindly. You just never knew it was mine. The realization hit her like a physical blow. You mean, all those dishes we loved at the holiday parties were made by me, I finished. In my kitchen, with my recipes, with my time and my love. She stood there for a moment, processing the implications. Then she turned to the growing crowd around my cooking station. Everyone, listen, she announced. This is Syra Ahmad. She's the one who's been making all our favorite dishes for years. The crowd pressed closer, and I could see recognition dawning on face after face. These were people who had raved about my cooking without knowing my name. Who had requested that delicious lamb dish and those amazing appetizers without ever connecting them to me. "You made the curry at Mina's birthday party last year," someone said. "I've been trying to recreate that recipe for months." "And the dessert at the Eid celebration," another guest added. "My children still talk about it." I felt my chest tighten with emotion, but I kept working. The biryani was ready, and I began plating it with the same attention to detail I'd shown the first course. Each grain of rice was perfect, each piece of meat tender, each garnish placed with artistic precision. As the second course was served, the praise became impossible to ignore. Guests were returning to my station, asking for seconds, wanting to know ingredients and techniques. The atmosphere had shifted from emergency management to celebration, and I was at the center of it all. "Syra," called out a voice from the crowd. It was Dr. Rashid, a family friend I'd known for years. "I had no idea you were this talented. Have you ever considered professional cooking?" The question hung in the air, and I felt every eye in the room turn to me. This was my moment, my chance to reclaim the dreams I'd abandoned 15 years ago. "I actually won a regional cooking competition once," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "First place." There was newspaper coverage, offers to cater events, even suggestions about opening a restaurant. The silence was profound. These people had known me for decades, had eaten my food and praised my skills, but they'd never known about my achievements. My potential, my dreams. "What happened?" Dr. Rashid asked gently. I glanced toward Mina, who was still standing frozen near the head table. "I was told that trophies don't cook husbands," I said. "That I was getting above my station. That I should be content with cooking for family." The crowd turned to look at Mina, and I saw her face flush with shame. She'd been exposed, not through my anger or accusations, but through the simple truth of my story. "So I put my trophy in a drawer," I continued, beginning the third course. "I cancelled interviews, stopped entering competitions, and spent the next 15 years proving my worth through service instead of achievement." I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "I've cooked for your parties, your celebrations, your difficult times. I've babysat your children, helped with your problems, and contributed to your successes. But I've been invisible, taken for granted, and ultimately dismissed when I was no longer convenient." The third course was my grandmother's curry, a complex dish that required 6 different spice blends and 3 hours of slow cooking. I'd prepared it earlier that morning, knowing it would be the crown jewel of the meal. The aroma filled the room as I served it, and I could see people closing their eyes in appreciation. "This is what authentic cooking looks like," I said, my voice stronger now. "This is what happens when someone puts their heart, their heritage, and their skill into food. This is what you get when you value tradition over trends, substance over style." Zara appeared at my elbow, her face streaked with tears. "Auntie Syra," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw genuine remorse in her eyes. "You had no idea because you never asked," I said. "You took my contributions for granted because I never demanded recognition. You dismissed my food because you never understood its value." The room had grown quiet, everyone straining to hear our conversation. I could feel the weight of their attention, the power of this moment. "But you do understand now," I continued, gesturing to the guests who were devouring my cooking with obvious pleasure. "You understand that skill and passion can't be bought. That authenticity has value, that tradition deserves respect." I began packing up my equipment, my demonstration complete. The 3 courses had been served, praised, and devoured. The wedding reception had been saved, but more importantly, I had been revealed. The garden tent behind the main reception hall was where Zara found me, sitting quietly among the wedding flowers with a cup of tea I'd made for myself. The celebration was continuing inside, but I needed a moment to process what had just happened, the vindication, the recognition, the 20 years of invisible labor finally acknowledged. She approached slowly, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white shadow. Her makeup was slightly smudged from tears, but her eyes were clear and focused. In a way I hadn't seen in years. "Auntie Syra," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "We need to talk." I looked at her over my teacup, noting the tremor in her voice. "Do we? Or do you need to talk while I listen, like always?" The directness of my response seemed to surprise her. She was used to my gentleness, my accommodating nature, my willingness to absorb problems without creating them. "I deserve that," she said quietly. "I deserve much worse than that." I set down my cup and leaned back in my chair. "Tell me what you think you deserve, Zara. Tell me what you think you've earned with your treatment of me." She took a shaky breath. I've been thinking about everything while you were cooking. About the video, about the planning meetings, about all the times we excluded you from decisions. About how we used your money and your skills but never your voice. Go on, I said, my voice neutral. I've been thinking about why we did it, she continued. And I think we were threatened by you. By your competence, your independence, your refusal to fit into the box we'd made for you. The admission hung in the air between us. I could hear the sounds of the reception continuing inside, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, but out here, it was just truth and consequences. You were threatening, I agreed. Because you reminded me of what I'd given up. Every time I saw you making your own choices, pursuing your own interests, I was reminded of the dreams I'd abandoned to keep peace with your mother. Zara's eyes widened. You resented me? I resented what you represented, I corrected. The freedom I'd never claimed, the voice I'd never used, the space I'd never demanded. It was easier to diminish you than to confront my own regrets. Before she could respond, Mina appeared at the entrance to the tent, her face a mask of fury and embarrassment. Zara, what are you doing out here? Your guests are asking for you. Zara looked between us, then stood up straighter. I'm talking to Auntie Syra, Mom. Something I should have done months ago. She's caused enough drama for one day, Mina said, her voice tight with anger. The wedding is ruined, the guests are confused, and everyone's talking about that ridiculous display in there. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 20 years of accumulated words I'd never spoken. Ridiculous display? I repeated. Is that what you call saving your daughter's wedding? Is that what you call feeding 200 guests who were about to leave hungry? Mina's face flushed red. You cancelled the catering. You created this crisis. I cancelled catering that was arranged with my money, signed with my name, and authorized by my signature, I shot back. I created a crisis? Or did I reveal the crisis that already existed, the fact that this entire wedding was built on my labor and my sacrifice while I was treated as disposable? The words came pouring out now, 20 years of swallowed anger and suppressed hurt. You've used me, Mina. You've used my skills, my money, my time, my love, and you've given me nothing in return except tolerance. You've made me small, quiet, grateful for scraps of recognition. That's not true, Mina protested, but her voice lacked conviction. It's completely true, I said, my voice rising. You told me my dreams were worthless, that my ambitions were above my station, that my value was in service rather than achievement. You made me believe that being useful was the same as being valued. Zara stepped between us, her face pale. Mom, is this true? Did you really tell her not to pursue her cooking professionally? The silence that followed was damning. Mina's inability to answer was answer enough. You were jealous, I continued, the truth finally crystallizing. You were jealous of my talent, my passion, my potential independence. You kept me small because you needed me to stay small. You needed me to believe I was nothing without this family's approval. Mina's composure cracked. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made, the responsibilities I've carried. You've never had children, never had a marriage to maintain, never had to put family before yourself. I've spent 20 years putting this family before myself, I said, my voice deadly quiet. I've funded your celebrations, cooked for your parties, and cared for your children. I've given you my youth, my dreams, and my identity. And you've given me nothing but the privilege of continuing to serve. Zara was crying now, her hands covering her face. I'm so sorry, Auntie. I'm so sorry for all of it. I looked at her, seeing genuine remorse but also the beginning of understanding. I don't want your apologies, Zara. I want your recognition. I want you to see me as a person with value beyond my usefulness to you. I turned to Mina, who was still standing frozen in the doorway. And I want you to know that your fear of my independence was justified. Because I am independent. I always have been. I just forgot it for a while. I walked past both of them, pausing at the tent entrance. Your guests are enjoying the food, Zara. The food you called village trash yesterday. The food that saved your wedding today. Remember that when you're telling the story to your children. The sun was setting as I returned to the main reception hall, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched my sari. The guests were still there, still eating, still talking about the unexpected turn the celebration had taken. But I wasn't returning to continue serving, I was returning to make my final statement. I approached the kitchen station where I'd been working and began preparing one last dish. Not for the crowd this time, but for myself. A simple meal that represented everything I'd learned, everything I'd sacrificed, and everything I was reclaiming. I prepared 3 small plates, each containing a different dish that marked a different phase of my journey. The first was a delicate rice pilaf, the kind I'd learned to make as a young bride eager to please. The second was the lamb roast that had won me a competition and a moment of recognition I'd been too afraid to embrace. The third was a simple curry, the kind my grandmother had taught me, passed down through generations of women who'd found power in feeding others. As I worked, I became aware of the crowd gathering around me again. But this time, I wasn't performing for them. I was cooking for myself, claiming space that had always been mine but that I'd never had the courage to occupy. When the 3 dishes were complete, I arranged them on a single plate and carried it to the head table. The bride and groom's seats were empty. They were still dealing with the emotional fallout of our conversation in the garden tent. I sat down in Zara's chair, placing my plate in front of me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The invisible woman who'd spent decades serving others was finally serving herself, sitting at the place of honor she'd earned but never claimed. I took a bite of the rice pilaf, tasting the innocence of my younger self, the woman who'd believed that service was love and that love was enough. The flavors were perfect, delicate, but somehow insufficient, like the dreams I'd abandoned to keep peace. The lamb roast came next, rich and complex, carrying the memory of victory and the bitterness of dreams deferred. This was the taste of my potential, the flavor of what I could have become if I'd been brave enough to fight for recognition. Finally, I tasted the curry, my grandmother's recipe that had been passed down through generations of women who'd found ways to matter in a world that tried to make them invisible. This was the taste of heritage, of strength, of the knowledge that had always been mine. As I ate, I spoke to the crowd that had gathered around me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet authority of someone who finally understood her worth. 20 years ago, I learned to cook to show love. 10 years ago, I learned to cook to prove worth. Today, I learned to cook to claim space. I took another bite, savoring the complexity of flavors that represented the complexity of my journey. Food is power, I continued. It nourishes, it brings people together, it carries culture and memory and love. But it's also labor, and skill, and art. And for too long, I've let others take credit for my art while I remained invisible. Dr. Rashid stepped forward from the crowd. Syra, I have to ask again, have you considered returning to professional cooking? What I've tasted today is extraordinary. I looked at him, then at the faces surrounding me. These people had eaten my food for years without knowing my name, had praised my skills without acknowledging my talent, had benefited from my labor without recognizing my contribution. I've been considering many things, I said. I've been considering the value of my time, the worth of my skills, the importance of my voice. I've been considering what it means to be visible, to be valued, to be heard. I stood up, leaving my plate on the table. I've been considering what it means to stop asking for permission to exist in spaces I've earned the right to occupy. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. I could see phones recording, capturing this moment when the invisible woman became impossible to ignore. This is my last meal in this role, I announced. The last time I'll cook for people who see my service as obligation rather than gift. The last time I'll make myself small to make others comfortable. I walked through the crowd, feeling their eyes on me but no longer caring about their judgment. At the exit, I paused and turned back. Thank you for teaching me the difference between being useful and being valued, I said. Thank you for showing me that dignity is something I give myself, not something I earn from others. I walked out of the reception hall, leaving behind not just a wedding but an entire identity I'd outgrown. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that promised a new dawn. I'd spent 20 years cooking for others, serving others, pleasing others. Tomorrow, I would begin cooking for myself. 1 week later, I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The morning light streamed through my windows, illuminating the space where I'd planned my rebellion and discovered my power. The same kitchen where I'd received the humiliating video now felt like a sanctuary of possibility. The knock at my door came at exactly 10 o'clock, as I'd been expecting. I opened it to find a delivery person holding a small package and an envelope with my name written in careful handwriting. After the delivery person left, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the envelope first. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored paper, the kind used for formal occasions. The handwriting was Zara's, but the tone was different from anything I'd ever received from her. Dear Auntie Syra, it began, I've been thinking about our conversation in the garden tent every day since the wedding. I've been thinking about the woman you showed me that day, not the quiet, accommodating person I thought I knew, but the strong, talented, independent woman who's been there all along. I paused in my reading to sip my tea, feeling the warmth of recognition that had been missing for so long. I've been thinking about how we treated you, how we took your contributions for granted, how we made you invisible while depending on your visibility to make our celebrations successful. I've been thinking about how wrong we were, how cruel we were, how blind we were to your worth. The letter continued for 2 pages, each paragraph revealing a deeper understanding of the dynamics that had shaped our relationship. She wrote about the privilege of being seen, the pain of being dismissed, the courage it takes to demand recognition. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote near the end, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. I see your talent, your strength, your dignity. I see the woman who saved my wedding not because she owed me anything, but because she chose to be gracious even when grace hadn't been shown to her. I opened the package to find my old competition trophy, polished until it gleamed like new. Attached was a small card. This belongs in a place of honor, not hidden in a drawer. You earned this, and you've earned so much more. I held the trophy, feeling its weight and remembering the pride I'd felt 15 years ago when I'd first won it. The woman who'd accepted this award had been full of dreams and possibilities. The woman holding it now had earned the right to pursue those dreams. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Ms. Ahmad? This is James Chen from the Riverside Restaurant Group. I was a guest at the wedding last weekend, and I was incredibly impressed by your cooking. I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you. I listened as he explained that he'd been looking for someone to develop an authentic cuisine program for his restaurant chain. Someone with real skill, genuine passion, and the ability to create dishes that told stories. I've been in the restaurant business for 20 years, he said, and I've never tasted anything like what you prepared that day. Would you be interested in meeting to discuss this further? I looked around my kitchen, at the trophy on my table, at the morning light streaming through my windows. 6 months ago, I would have been too afraid to even consider such an opportunity. A week ago, I would have been too angry to trust anyone's recognition of my worth, but today, I was ready. I'd be very interested, I said. But I should mention that I have some conditions about how I work, how I'm credited, and how my contributions are recognized. He laughed, a sound of genuine delight. Ms. Ahmad, anyone who could orchestrate what you did last weekend clearly knows her worth. I wouldn't expect anything less. After ending the call, I sat quietly for a moment, feeling the profound shift that had occurred in my life. The woman who'd been dismissed as serving village trash was now being courted by a restaurant chain. The woman who'd been told her dreams were worthless was now being offered a chance to pursue them professionally. I walked to my window and looked out at the morning sky. The humiliation that had driven me to rebellion had been transformed into opportunity. The anger that had motivated my revenge had been transformed into self-respect. The pain that had nearly broken me had been transformed into power. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rashid. Syra, my daughter is getting married next month. She specifically requested that you cater the reception. She said she wants real food from a real chef. Are you available? I smiled as I typed my response, I'm available. And I charge professional rates. I placed my trophy on the kitchen counter, where it caught the morning light and cast rainbows on the wall. This was where it belonged, not hidden away in shame, but displayed with pride. This was where I belonged, not in the shadows of others' celebrations, but in the light of my own recognition. I began planning my day, my week, my future. There were recipes to perfect, meetings to schedule, dreams to pursue. I had wasted 20 years making myself small, invisible, grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. I wouldn't waste another day. The woman who'd walked out of that wedding reception had been transformed by fire, not consumed by it, but purified by it. The woman sitting in this kitchen now was someone I was proud to be, visible, valued, and finally, completely free. Peace, I realized, wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of self-respect. And for the first time in 20 years, I was serving myself exactly what I deserved.